Hello, everyone, and welcome to Probing New Public Opinion Data for an Informed Response. This is the first in a series of Zoom forums where we at MassINC and the MassINC Polling Group will examine COVID-19 public opinion research and explore existing as well as potential new policies designed to address the impacts of COVID-19. We begin today with the topic of housing, as is clear from the title of this event, Making Rent and Paying the Mortgage. How can we avoid another housing crisis? We will be digging into the very real economic fallout of the pandemic and its impact on renters and homeowners across the state. Of course, we must recognize that COVID-19 is not the only reason for housing insecurity. As researchers and pollsters, we are well aware of the systemic racial inequity in healthcare, education, transit, justice, employment, and of course, housing in our Commonwealth and nation. Our conversation today features an overview of public opinion polling conducted by MassINC Polling Group President Steve Gazella, and later a run-through of policy implications by MassINC Research Director Ben Foreman. Before we begin, I want to thank the sponsors of the poll, Beacon Communities, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, Preservation of Affordable Housing, the Boston Foundation, the Community Builders, Trinity Financial, and Wynn Companies. At the end of today's conversation, we welcome your thoughts, reactions, and we'll address your questions. So as you're listening, please feel free to make use of the chat function in the Zoom call. With that, I want to turn it over to the president of the MassINC Polling Group, who is responsible for this new data. Welcome, Steve Gazella.
Thank you, Juana, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I will be presenting the results of a survey that we just conducted among residents in Massachusetts. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen that shows the slides that we'll be discussing. Like I said, the survey, my discussion is going to center on a survey that we just conducted, mostly on housing issues, but also we covered issues of economics and also issues of health. If you're interested in reading more, the full results are posted on our website at massincpolling.com. I've also seen articles on the Boston Globe. There's one, I wrote it up on Commonwealth, and there will be other write-ups forthcoming as well. Before I start, I also want to echo my thanks to the sponsors, which are listed here on this slide. Just a quick run through of what the survey actually is. This is a statewide survey of just over 1,500 residents of Massachusetts. So this isn't just registered voters. It's not likely voters. This is a survey of residents. It was conducted May 20th to the 25th. So this is pretty fresh, very fresh data. Of course, the coronavirus crisis is changing things very quickly. So this is something that I think, a lot of these are issues that I think would probably merit continuing to track, but just to give you a sense of when this particular data was collected, those were the field dates for this survey. And then again, the sponsors of the actual survey portion are listed here on this slide. A quick run through of some of the key findings, which I won't spend a ton of time on because we're actually going to get into some of the numbers behind these. But the first, and I think the biggest thing out of this, is that the economic crisis really has brought challenges to the housing market among the same demographics that have been hit by the economic crisis that the coronavirus has brought about. So the same demographics are suffering from issues like unemployment, job and wage losses, food insecurity, that we're actually going to be posting a piece on Commonwealth a little bit later about that, and housing insecurity, and that's the main topic of today. So in terms of housing, 29% of renters say that between April and June they have either not made their full payment. So they've either not paid a month or any months, or they've not paid at least part of rent in one of those months. The same number among homeowners is 13%, and that owes a lot to just socioeconomic differences between renters and homeowners, which we'll see on some of the following slides. Looking at how terms have been modified, most do not say that their terms have been modified. Most renters and most mortgages say that the terms of their rent or the terms of their mortgages at this point have not been modified. Then looking ahead to August, which of course is when the current state eviction moratorium is set to expire, only 21% of renters say that it's very likely that they'll be able to catch up by then. So that's certainly another thing to kind of keep our eye on. And then looking ahead over the next few months, those 29% and 13% numbers who say that they've not paid in full at this point, we'll see that those numbers are going to continue to change as the crisis continues. So like I said at the beginning, economic stress is very, very heavily concentrated. And then the other thing, actually, we're putting a piece on WBUR in a little bit. The other thing that's happening is that those in the most economic distress are also much more likely to say that they've had COVID-19 in their household. So it's both an economic, a housing, and a healthcare crisis, all hitting the same groups of people. So what's to be done about it? That was another point of this poll, was to look at some of the potential policy responses that people would or would not support. And we found that there was a pretty broad support among residents for a whole bunch of different things. So extending the eviction moratorium, supporting rent, funds for building and improving affordable housing, and also affordable housing developments in residents' own communities. So then let's look at some of the actual numbers. So this first slide, it shows the percent of residents in each one of these categories who just say that they're either furloughed or they're unemployed between demographic groups. And there's a million demographic groups that you can look at this by, and there's a bunch more of them on our website. So if you're interested in looking deeper into the crosstabs, I would encourage and welcome you to do so. But these are just a couple that we picked out just to kind of show how different the economic consequences of coronavirus have been between renters and owners, where 26% of renters say that they're either furloughed or unemployed, compared to just 13% among owners. 13% still, by normal standards, an incredibly high number, but you really can see the disparate impact here between renters and owners at this point. And then the same thing by income group that you see there on the right side of the chart, with 33% of those making under 50,000 last year, and that kind of declines down to 10% when you get up to the 100,000 plus range. So one of the challenges of this poll was that there's so many different ways of looking at economic distress. We wanted to kind of be able to combine them all together. So as sort of a crude way of doing this, we put together the different questions that we asked: whether you missed all or part of a month of your housing payment, whether you struggle to provide food for your family, whether you've gotten food from a food bank, whether you've lost pay or are just unemployed, to get a sense of the spectrum of economic distress that we're talking about. And you can see that in the boxes on the right, just over half say that none of these things have happened to them since the coronavirus crisis began. And then the composite score adds up as you go down this table: 22% the second category, then 12%, and then 8% in that most distressed group. And the reason that this is important is because it helps us look at the ways that different demographic groups are experiencing this without having to put together and look at each one of those different questions. This next slide then looks at the more and most distressed categories put together. So how much of each one of these different groups are in the more or most economically distressed categories? And for this particular, there's a bunch of interesting things about this slide, or about this chart. First of all, I think it's just the size of differences between some of these demographic groups is interesting. And then from a housing specific standpoint, I think looking at the difference between gateway cities and elsewhere, for instance, really brings that issue to light, that the economic distress is concentrated in gateway cities, and very concentrated among renters as well. 36% of renters fall into one of either the more or the most economically distressed categories, compared to 15% of owners. You can also see that the differences are very significant between different groups, different education and income groups, age groups, and particularly by race and ethnicity, where you have 50% of Hispanic respondents, 45% of Black respondents falling into one of those two categories. Sorry to zoom through these slides. We have a lot to get through, so I know that some of these are dense, and I'd love to spend an hour talking about each one. But just to carry on, what this one shows then is the percent of renters and owners who have missed any of their housing payments. 13% among owners, 29% among renters, for an overall rate of 16% statewide who say that they've missed any of their rent or any of their mortgage payments. And again, this is between April and June. Survey was taken at the end of May, so we asked about expectation of June and figured that 5 days ahead of time, people would have a pretty good sense at that point of whether or not they were going to be able to make their June payments. Okay, but what demographic groups does that really include? And this one also shows some of the disparities that we looked at a couple slides ago. these are the percents of each one of these demographic groups who say that they've missed a housing payment between April and June. On the left, you see the most likely groups to say that, and on the right, you see the least likely groups to say that. So there's some, again, just some very big gaps there. One of them is age. So the people under 30, your 18 to 29-year-olds, 35% there say that they've missed a housing payment since April. And then looking at the bottom of the right chart, you see the other side of that, which is that 4% of residents 60 plus say the same. You also have a similar gap between non-white and white respondents, where you had 33% of non-white respondents on the left saying they've missed a housing payment compared to 11% of white respondents. 29% of renters, that's another one, a number we've heard a couple of times now. You can also see the impact of education, with 22% of people with high school or less as their highest level of education, compared to 5% with an advanced degree. So just very big, very significant differences in the level of economic pain that different demographic groups in Massachusetts are experiencing at this point. How is this then going to continue to play out? So what this looks at is the percent from April to June who either paid their housing payment in full, which is the dark red bar at the top, or in part, which is the sort of pinkish bar line coming up there at the bottom. And then looking ahead, among those who were able to pay in full in June, we then asked them, okay, well, how much longer could you continue to pay in full? And then use that to figure how many people would be paying in full in a month or two, 3 or 4 months, 5 or 6 months, and so forth. And you can see that among renters, the numbers over the next couple months are going to go down further. And then 3 or 4 months out, if the economic situation is in any way resembles what it is today, I think, well, this survey suggests that the rental payment numbers are going to continue to slide at a pretty dramatic rate. So then we asked whether your rental terms have been modified or are they the same as they were. And this slide shows that comparison between people who have made all of their payments or people who have missed any of their payments. And the blue bar is people who have missed any of their payments between April and June. Among that group, 35% say that their rental terms have been modified. 62% say that the rental terms are the same as they have been. A key question then is whether people know about the eviction moratorium, and we asked basically a knowledge level question on that, and we found that adding up the 2 bars on the left, 51% say they've heard either a great deal or a fair amount about the eviction moratorium. That I think encouragingly, it's not shown here, but the knowledge is higher among people who have missed payments or people who need it. But there's still considerable work to do, I think, to expand that knowledge level, because even among people who have missed payments, knowledge of the eviction moratorium is far from universal. Looking ahead to the end of the eviction moratorium, then this chart shows people's assessment of their own likelihood of catching up by the time the eviction moratorium ends in August. And we see 21% say that they are very likely to be able to catch up by the time the moratorium ends in August. Another 58% say somewhat likely. Of course, these are, I think, necessarily imprecise assessments that people are making. You know, they're trying to figure out what could be happening over the next few months. And as we all know, the economic news changes very quickly and changes even day to day. But at this point, I think the key number is that only 1 in 5 renters who are behind think that it's very likely they'll be able to catch up by the time the moratorium expires in August. So then looking over at mortgages, this shows basically the same concept that we just looked at for renters a few slides ago, except for mortgage holders. We can see the dark red line is the percent of people who say that they have either paid or planned to pay June, for instance, in full, or plan to pay in the future in full. And then their assessment going forward among those who did remain current through June as to whether or not they're going to be able to continue to do so. So interesting attributes of this chart really are that the percentages are higher than they are among the rental market, not surprisingly, given the socioeconomic differences of the people that the charts represent, but also that these numbers too continue to slide as the months go on. As the longer that the current economic conditions persist, the more it appears that people say that mortgage rental rates or mortgage payment rates will continue to decline. So this is a similar slide to what we looked at previously, which is, and this is among people who have missed a payment. 31% say that their bank insisted on full payment. 53% said that their bank has worked with them to find an arrangement. Then looking at modification of terms among people who have either made all of their payments or missed any of their payments, we see here that 40% of those who have missed any of the payments, which is represented by the dark blue bar here, say that the terms have been modified, and 47% say that the terms are the same as they were before. So looking then at potential policy responses, this one here shows support for various ideas that we presented to the poll respondents. We found the highest levels of support for requiring mortgage lenders to modify terms of home loans and for government funding for temporary help to renters who have lost jobs or income to the crisis. And then just about the same level, perhaps a couple points lower, is extending the state moratorium on evictions through the end of 2020. The bottom two here still over 60%, well over 60%, were support for providing funds to rehab or renovate existing affordable housing or to construct new affordable housing. We looked at that in a little bit more detail on the slide actually that's after this one. This one shows support for building new affordable housing broken out by demographics, just because this is one where I think sort of conventionally we think of there being big differences in support levels between different demographic groups. And we see that there is some difference. 84% among Democrats support the idea of constructing additional affordable housing. 54% among Republicans, smaller but still a majority. And you see the same among renters and homeowners, but still 68% of homeowners say that they support the policy proposal as we described it, which was state government providing more funds to construct new affordable housing. We see some difference also by income, with the lowest, with those making it under 50,000, supporting this with 79%, and 65% of those making over $100,000 saying that they would support this proposal. Okay, but how about in your own community? That's often the question, which is, the idea is that people support the construction of affordable housing in the abstract, but do they actually support it when it comes to the idea of putting it up in their own community? And here too, we found pretty strong levels of support. So overall, 77% support for construction of new affordable housing. And the lowest, 69%, was still a pretty strong majority for mixed income housing. But across the board, pretty considerable majority say that they would support the construction of each one of these kinds of housing, even in their own community. We then also broke that up by demographics. So the three lines of this chart are the three kinds of housing that we just looked at in the previous slide: affordable housing, housing for people in low-wage jobs, or mixed income housing. And then the numbers in the chart are the percent who say that they would support each one of these, then broken out by demographic group. So we wanted to see again, is this something where there are sharp differences by socioeconomic groups? Are there sharp differences by party, renters versus owners, and so forth? And found that again, the differences do exist, but they're perhaps not as wide as we might think. So affordable housing, for instance, 86% of renters, 73% of owners. That's the first line I'm looking at now. 88% of Democrats and 61% of Republicans. So again, there is a gap, but even among Republicans, the group with the lowest support, still 61% support, so a pretty good sized majority. And then looking across income categories, we'll just take the second line here. 84% of those making under 50,000 said that they would support the idea of constructing housing for people in low-wage jobs in their community. And 2/3, so 67% of those over 100,000 said the same. So the gaps do exist, but again, they're perhaps not as sharp as you might think without doing the poll. So that's a very, very quick run through of some of the highlights of the survey. Again, the full results are posted on massincpolling.com, and we'll be writing them up and posting other things about this kind of throughout the day and throughout the week. So with that, then I'd like to turn it over to Ben Foreman. Ben is the research director at MassINC, and he's taken a deeper look at the policy implications of some of these numbers. I should say he's conducted additional deeper analysis of some of these numbers.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think all of us understand that a crisis of this magnitude can cast a long shadow that we pick up years or decades into the future. We're seeing right now actual reductions in educational attainment from the Great Recession. Economists find reduction in employment and lifetime earnings, especially for people who graduate into a period of prolonged high unemployment. And there's lots of research looking at the health impacts and finding in particular higher incidence of depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illness years after a crisis. I didn't put the citations in here, but if you just go to Google Scholar and look up economic scarring, you'll find pages and pages of abstracts to support these long-term implications. So the challenge for government is, how do we minimize these impacts? What can we do today that will ensure that in the future we don't have serious problems in economic scarring? In order to think about that, we need to know what resources are available. The federal picture is uncertain. I don't know how many heard the Marketplace morning report this morning. There's discussion about will they or will they not extend the expanded unemployment benefits that end at the end of July. The state budget picture is looking like the gaps is going to be closer to the upper estimate that was predicted when the crisis first emerged. The real question, though, is municipal governments, the ones who are closest to the ground and most able to reach those who need the most support. What resources do they have? We haven't seen yet an estimate of property tax impacts, and Steve's data give us information that will be helpful to model what kind of money municipal governments are going to be not collecting in the form of property taxes, which is by far and away their largest share of revenue. For our gateway cities, they definitely depend significantly on state aid, and that is in jeopardy. But they also collect a lot of revenue from residential property taxes in particular. So we have Steve's data that showed the share of owners who aren't making mortgage payments and who don't expect to be able to continue making them within a month or two's time as their savings run out. We can take these data and combine them with information from the census on how much families or households in each of these income categories pay per month in property taxes. We also have Steve's survey data from renters, same categories, who aren't making rental payments at the moment. It's a little bit more difficult to predict how much that's going to translate to in terms of property tax losses, but if we just take what their monthly rent is and assume maybe 10% of that goes to property taxes. Again, this is difficult because multifamily buildings have significant reserves. Landlords may make tax payments even if their renters aren't paying rent, but I think these are all fairly conservative assumptions. And again, these are by just the folks who aren't making any payments at all. The survey picked up a much larger group of people who are making some payments. So it's hard to tell whether that will lead to reductions in property taxes or not. But when we just do this very conservative math to give us an order of magnitude estimate of what we're looking at here, you can see that if you kind of total up what's missed each month through the end of the calendar year, it's about $180 million across the state. You can see sort of the impact a little bit of the tax refunds that were provided, but we're definitely picking up a lot of support that's being delivered through the extended unemployment assistance program, as I'll show you here. The share of households who are rent burdened at the moment is very small for Massachusetts standards. And that is when you look at the unemployment benefits that households are receiving, in addition to the normal unemployment benefits of about half their income. So this is really helping renters cover their housing costs. But what will happen when those expanded benefits apply, that extra $600 a week, expire at the end of July? All of a sudden, you'll see that renters, if they just had their traditional unemployment insurance benefit, which is about half of their paycheck, renters who are very low income or moderate income would have a very difficult time shouldering their housing cost. It would take up a very significant piece of their unemployment insurance payments. So if you add these folks now who aren't covered and anticipate that they would start to miss rent payments, what would the property tax picture look like now? We'd be losing about another $80 million just through the end of the calendar year. Again, this is sort of very conservative estimates, best case scenarios, assuming that unemployment declines rather sharply as things reopen and we don't have another significant disruption. The thing that we're most concerned about at MassINC is what would the impact be for our Gateway City families where the households who are most vulnerable are living? What would the tax implications be there? We know, again, they're more exposed to the state budget. They get more than half their revenue from local aid. Adding this other hit from residential property taxes would be hard. And this picture, again, it doesn't include commercial properties, so there are these significant losses there as well. Steve's data, again, they back up the challenges Gateway City households have. 44% of the respondents from Gateway Cities have been furloughed or unemployed. Over a third are struggling with food insecurity, and nearly a third have missed a payment already. The reason I think we need to pay particular attention to this now is because many people of color who have been pushed out of Boston neighborhoods have been moving to Gateway Cities and purchasing homes in these communities, hoping to build equity and not be displaced again, but actually benefit from the growth in our economy. And these households and their equity is particularly vulnerable at a time when these governments are really unstable. They don't have a lot of cash reserves going into this crisis, and it's really hard. It's going to be really hard for them to shoulder this financial blow. And we can see that not only have the majority of Black buyers and Hispanic and Latino buyers purchased in Gateway Cities, but many of them are purchasing in the most unstable areas of our more unstable cities. About 16% of white buyers in Gateway Cities purchase in census tracts with poverty rates over 20%. But about a third of Black owners and more than a third of Latino owners are in neighborhoods with significant poverty. And so any instability is going to put their equity that they're trying to build more at risk. In terms of policy and what we can do about this, there's no question, again, that the expanded employment insurance has helped a lot. And the longer we can continue to provide that, the better off our communities are going to be. In Massachusetts, we've added to that with our RAF program to ensure that people who are trouble making rent month to month have an option. Some cities like Boston have a local emergency rental assistance program. But I think we need to understand that this crisis is different than what we faced in the Great Recession in 2018. I think we can talk a bit about that as we get into the discussion, but small businesses are definitely struggling here. Those are really important to the stability of these residential neighborhoods. So making sure that they can reopen and contribute to neighborhoods' health is really important. And there's a new program that we and MACDC and many others have been working on in Mass Housing to coordinate neighborhood-based efforts and interventions that I think is really promising and particularly important given the road ahead for us. So that's my take, my slides, and I'll turn it back over to Juana now for conversation.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Ben, for your very thoughtful presentations. We've been getting a lot of questions in our Zoom chat, so thank you for all of those who have already written your questions. And for those who haven't, please feel free to use the chat function and please provide your feedback, thoughts, reactions, and questions, and we look forward to answering them. And to begin the question session of this program, I'd like to start with a question myself. We know a defining aspect of the Great Recession for Gateway Cities was the foreclosure crisis it spawned. It sounds like we don't anticipate a large wave of foreclosures this time around, but are there still lessons from that response that we can apply now?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to that at the end of my presentation, but I think with a lot of housing people on the phone, we should all acknowledge that a lot of work has been done to support low and moderate income owners in Massachusetts, and that most of the loans that have been underwritten in recent years were done really well and really responsibly. And that means the people who are servicing those loans are going to really hopefully provide a lot of support to make sure that mortgage owners are able to stay current, or that they have some flexibility. So I think that, number one, that is a good news story. But again, I think thinking about the health of neighborhoods overall, many of our neighborhoods were left with wounds from the Great Recession that haven't healed. They still have vacant and abandoned property. They had retail districts that weren't as occupied and as contributing an asset and money to the neighborhood as they could or should be. And they had schools that were underfunded for a decade or more, at least. And so I think we got to think holistically. We got to think about that Student Opportunity Act and the commitment we made to have our inclusive urban communities have strong schools and be desirable places for people to live in our Commonwealth. And we got to think about those small businesses and make sure that those areas of the communities don't go dark, as well as obviously helping with residential stability and all the supports we can to keep people from being displaced.
Great. And now to take some questions from our audience. We've received at least 12 to 13 questions. I'll start with Roxanne, and she says the following. Do we have any idea of what % of owners not currently paying their mortgage normally, or any part of it, are paying out of rent or rental property their mortgage? Steve, was that something that you guys were able to capture in your polling data?
I think the question is how these non-payment rates relate to what would normally be a non-payment rate, if I'm understanding the question correctly. We didn't ask anything historical, so I couldn't say, for instance, was someone who didn't pay in April, were they already paying or not paying? That's a good question, and certainly would be an interesting thing to analyze in the future. If I didn't understand that correctly, maybe just add something else in the chat and we'll see if we can address it.
I mean, I think what they might be getting at is we have a lot of triple deckers in Massachusetts,
yeah.
right, where the owner occupied. Okay. And so to make their mortgage payment, they got to come up with their rent, but also the 2 units above them. And that's really kind of hard to suss out from our data. I think, Steve, we had the number of rooms, but we don't have the number of units in the property.
Yeah, and we did not ask that specific question. I understand it better now. We did not ask about a property that you might own, figuring that the rates of respondents that we would get for that would say yes to that would be low enough that it wouldn't give us enough to analyze separately. So we don't have. It would be really interesting and to do for another survey, look at small landlords, for instance. But the question of whether we do not have a breakout for landlords of small multifamily houses or anything like that in this survey.
Yeah. And I should say, I neglected to mention that there's been really good work done in this area by both Bo Zhao and his team of economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and MAPC as well. Steve's numbers help all of that analysis because they tell us who was actually paid. The Federal Reserve study, for instance, just told us there was about $700 a month in housing payments at risk. We can start to see now who's paid. I think a big question is are we missing undocumented households in your survey, Steve? We don't ask about immigration status, but there's certainly reason to believe it might be harder to get those households on the phone.
Yeah, I mean, that's one. There's many surveys recently where we would have loved to ask many questions about immigration, but after a lot of soul searching over the last few years, just decided we couldn't ask about it, even if the breakout would be really useful, because it was just not a topic that we felt like our respondents should be asked to discuss, given all of the political and other sensitivities about discussing or disclosing immigration status. So it makes us poorer, I think, for not knowing, for not being able to analyze things that way, but that's why we don't ask any questions about that.
Thank you both. We now have another question for you, Steve, from Jolanda. When you refer to expectations, if the crisis continues, how should we interpret crisis? Are people thinking about their own employment status, about COVID-related restrictions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's always some, interpretation that people apply to the survey question, however we phrase it. But the way that we phrase this particular one for rent, for instance, was how much longer do you anticipate being able to pay your rent if the current situation continues? So that would let them apply their own, their own thoughts about their own situation to that. They could think about the state or national situation and so forth. So there's, I think, a lot of different ways that could be asked, but that's the way we asked about it for for rent, and pretty much the same way. Yeah, we asked exactly the same thing for mortgage. How much longer do you anticipate being able to pay your mortgage if the current situation continues?
So would you say, Ben and Steve, Steve, in your data, homeowners were expressing that looking ahead in the months to come, they feel less certain about making full payments. We know that the moratorium is supposed to be lifted at the end of August, and that the expanded unemployment benefits are set to expire in July. Are we just seeing the early stages of a crisis, and really in the next months to come, we really don't know what would happen if these federal government and state government support systems are removed?
I mean, from a survey standpoint, I think it's pretty clear that people expect the rates, or more people expect to not be able to pay the longer this goes on. So whether that extent, how exactly to describe that, I think perhaps I'd let Ben address. But the charts on the two line charts we looked at for the percent who said that they'd be able to continue to pay, a month or two out, additional months out, we're down to 67% on rent. 3 to 4 months, we're at 57%. 5 or 6 months, we're at 53%. Say that they're going to be able to continue to pay. So, 20 right now with 29% already saying that they've missed at least part of a payment. That's already a very high number, but the numbers just continue to get worse, I think. So what exactly that looks like, or how to describe it on a national scale or statewide scale, I think perhaps Ben could respond to. But just in terms of the pace or the direction of it, I think the rental market is headed there more quickly, but the mortgage market certainly seems to be moving in that direction, albeit more slowly as well.
Great. We now have another question from Matt. Did the poll identify renters receiving rental subsidies, Section 8? If so, were those renters aware that their rent could be adjusted under the subsidy program? Did these respondents take advantage of rent recalculation? Was that part of the analysis in the poll, Steve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did ask that question. Exactly what they were aware of, I don't know the answer to that specific aspect of it, but we did break things out that way. The crosstabs, I'm going to put the link to the top line crosstabs, and the polling slides also are now posted on massincpolling.com. I'll put the link here in the chat so people can go look at that if they want. But one of the breakouts in the crosstabs is for people who live in Section 8 housing. So any of these responses you want to be able to look at that way, those are available in the crosstabs.
Thank you, Steve. We now have a question from Tim. Do you break out data for Boston?
We do have regional breakouts also in the crosstabs. When you get down to the city of Boston, you're starting to get into somewhat smaller sample sizes, even though this is a larger sample statewide, 1,500, with 8 or 9% or so living in the city of Boston, you're still getting down pretty small. And then if you wanted to break it up by neighborhoods within Boston, you're smaller still. So there are regional breakouts in the crosstabs, and I see the link is now posted in the chat. So I'd encourage people to go in there and look if you want to look at regional breakouts.
Thank you, Steve. We now have a question that I know your poll shed some light on, and looking at how there are disparities depending on demographics, how Hispanic and our Black communities are impacted and feeling more distressed than others. So this question is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, have you seen any racial disparities among renters and homeowners that were able to pay their mortgage or rent payments? Could you talk for both, i.e. renters versus homeowners, the racial demographics in any areas it was more concentrated?
Yeah, good question. I do have it broken out overall, but not, for instance, I don't have black homeowners versus black renters, for instance. It again becomes a sample size issue, just given the demographics of the state. So that is an issue I'd love to look at more, but for this survey, you're getting down into pretty small sample sizes if you try to break out, for instance, black respondents into subgroups beyond that. But we do see that there were disparities overall in terms of payment rate, missed payments between white respondents and black and Hispanic respondents.
Thank you, Steve. And another question, colleges serve as economic engines for so many gateway cities. Does the data indicate if areas with college-related housing serve as a bulwark against these trends?
Good question. We did not break it out by that with that specific geographic breakout, but we do have zip code of respondents, for instance, so we could kind of regroup things almost however we wanted. So that's the kind of thing which we could potentially look at. I'd say that, you know, young people were some of the most likely to say that they'd suffered various kinds of distress that were measured in this poll. So, you know, perhaps it was a bulwark to a certain extent, but certainly didn't prevent, you know, young people from experiencing some of the highest levels of economic distress of any group that we looked at in the survey. So our under 30s, for instance, looking back at that, the chart that we looked at for the two highest categories of economic distress, we found 41% of young people in that category and just 7% of those over 60. So huge, you know, huge differences in what the economic experience has been during the coronavirus crisis between people of different age groups.
And some additional questions here. This is from Jack. Why do you believe there was slightly less support for mixed income housing compared to affordable housing and housing for low wage earners?
Yeah, I didn't quite really know what to make of that one, to be honest. I mean, I think that the main message I took away was that they were all kind of the same, that they were all high, I should say, not the same. I didn't mean to say that, but there was a majority for each one. But why exactly that one was a little bit lower, I couldn't say for sure. That was the only question that we asked about that, so we didn't really dig into, you know, what people might hear when they hear each one of those terms, for instance. I think but that is certainly something that I'd be interested in looking at more in the future. Just to remind people, we found 69% support for mixed income housing described that way, and 77% for affordable housing. So only a 7-point difference, but even so, interesting. Just an interesting ordering, and one that I didn't necessarily have a great explanation for when I saw it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one's worth unpacking a little bit. I had the same thought. I mean, Steve, you know this stuff as a pollster better than I, but part of it may just be that people are unfamiliar with the concept, and we need to do a little bit more education around it. But I think the good news overall is that the vast majority of people seem to support the idea of more affordable housing in their own communities. I think there's probably greater understanding now of the role housing markets have played in creating inequality, and hopefully the importance of stable housing for people to have economic mobility and economic opportunity. But you know, I think if we're serious about these divides and healing them, housing is fundamentally important. And I think, so if that kind of piece about whether they deserve it or not is finally gone from the conversation, I think that barriers we'll still face are undoubtedly kind of open space issues. Do people want to see more development in communities that are already increasingly dense in traffic? You know, one area where I do think we're going to have some opportunity out of this crisis is retail that will no longer be with us. All those dying malls are dead now, probably. How quickly could we get them and create housing opportunities there and really solve an eyesore problem for communities while creating a lot more housing opportunities? I think that's going to be a big one for us to take advantage of, where it's kind of win-win. Thank
you both. Harry has a question, and it's, has the concept of socialized housing been discussed? My opinion is that if you can't have both housing as a good investment and housing as being affordable at the same time.
Not in this, we didn't explore that in this survey, you know, that's certainly something we could potentially explore in a future survey, but in this particular one, we did not explore that issue.
And just a couple of more questions that we want to make sure we get to before the end of our Zoom forum. We have a question from David. Is there a recommended action plan after August? There is no relief for small landlords in the legislation, given that rent payments won't just be switched on.
I missed the very beginning of that question, Juana, I'm sorry.
No, not a problem. Let me repeat it. Is there a recommended action plan after August? There is no relief for small landlords in the legislation, given that rent payments won't just be switched on.
Ben, what do you think about that one?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go further than my area of expertise here and what we've looked at. But I do understand the problem. I think that if housing is something that we all see as a priority as a Commonwealth, we all need to figure out how to pay for it. It can't be the landlords that absorb the blow as this crisis extends and deepens. So I think obviously in the poll we see large majority support for providing funds for all forms of housing assistance. And I think that we're going to have to figure out how to do that in order to keep people stably housed.
And I think a good follow-up question to the one we just answered. This question is from Luke, and it reads as follows. Given the level of federal recovery support already out there, are you surprised at how much rent payments have declined? How do you read this data?
I didn't really know what to expect, I'd say, coming into this. I didn't know really, you know, what kind of rates to expect. Luke's question, I think the very detailed question that he wrote in the chat, it also makes, I think, some great points, which is that there are categories of people who did not not receive the support necessarily. So perhaps that has something to do with it. But I think the thing that, looking at this data in total, that I really took away from it is that that what's going on right now, it's a lot of the main challenges of this crisis are all hitting the same people. So it's a housing crisis, it's a jobs crisis, it's a food, you know, there's food insecurity. And then the piece that I wrote for WBUR that should be up soon is that it's also a lot of the same people are also have COVID in their household. So there's huge disparities, for instance, in that economic distress spectrum as far as the incidence of actually having someone in your household who's tested positive for COVID or who's had the symptoms. I mean, huge differences, like a quarter of people in the lowest, in the most distressed categories compared to 1 or 2% in the least distressed categories. So I think that the main thing that this poll, I think, once again drove home, and I know we've seen some elements of this before, but the thing that it really drove home for me is that how many different elements of this crisis the same people are experiencing. It's the same people experiencing a lot of the different challenges that the crisis is bringing on. So certainly I didn't really know what to expect, getting back to Luke's question, but I think that's the main thing that I came away with from it.
You know, just to add to that, I was on a call this morning with the Rappaport Institute. They're doing an ethnographic study of 60 low-income families in Massachusetts. I encourage people to check out the blog because they're able to, in talking with families who are experiencing this in real time, they're able to understand how severe the challenge is. I mean, when you hear from single mothers who are worried about their kids being orphaned because they've experienced death around them, you know, that's significant trauma, and add to that the idea that they may not have a place to live in a few weeks' time. I think the news media has done a pretty good job of covering these stories, but I think for those of us who are not living in Chelsea and other communities that have been really borne the brunt of this, it's just really difficult to understand the intensity of this problem. And I think, you know, Rachel mentioned BRAF programs like that are critical to alleviating some of that that trauma and concern.
Yeah, no, and I think just to add to that, we saw a little bit of this in your data, Steve. You weren't able to dive deep into it, but the people that are feeling the greatest distress are underserved populations, younger people, people of color, people who have been socio disadvantaged economically. And so this is something that's been going on for generations, and it makes us really look at, and I think COVID has laid bare this, the inequities that we have in our systems, not just in our Commonwealth, but across this country. And it really gives us food for thought as to what we should be doing to really implement policies that really start eradicating these structural inequities that exist. But moving on to another question, and this one's from Jerry. Perhaps a little bit outside of the scope of this work, but marketing research suggests young people don't see home ownership as a path to economic independence. Is there a need for more awareness, education on this topic? Do you agree with the premise?
Ben, do you want to take that one?
I mean, I don't know how much of that is anecdotal and how much of it is real.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there certainly is some of that in maybe markets like Boston, where home ownership is just out of reach.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is it's simply out of reach. If you want to stay here, you have to find some other path, I think, for many, many people. So I think the other question, though, that I think a lot of people were going to start to grapple with is how much the housing supports inhibit mobility. We saw a lot of stickiness after the Great Recession, with people not moving to places where there was new jobs and economic opportunity. And I would think that some are going to say, we don't want to encourage that. We want the economy to be more fluid and dynamic and adjust. So we shouldn't be providing housing supports that inhibit people from getting up and moving. But I think given the reality of this crisis, and again, thinking about the Chelseas, I'd be very concerned if, at least in the short and medium term, we're not doing as much as we can to give people basic stability.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Ben, I don't know whether, that's a factual statement, but I know that a lot of our younger people just carry a lot of college and student debt, right? That make it harder for them to see the possibility of being a homeowner a possibility. So I think that's another consideration that could be taken into account, just because the amount of debt that they finish with after college can be really, really challenging. We have another question from David. Is there an analysis of the impacts on housing market from lower and middle income employees, like restaurants and hotels might not reopen?
I mean, I think that's gets at the big unknown in all this, which is, how long does this go on, and where do we go from here? Workers who were in jobs that don't come back. That's the kind of thing where you look back at those line charts and you think, okay, what does happen if the economic situation people are experiencing right now continues for months more, if the place that they were working does not reopen? A lot depends, of course, on what the policy response is at the federal and state levels, but I think that those are sort of built into those charts as you move sort of further and further to the right, into the 1 and 2 months, 3 and 4 months range. That's what we are trying to look at, with not just who's missed so far, but if things don't change, if things don't improve for the people who are in these situations, then how long are they sustainable? That was the question we were trying to get at there, and I think businesses reopening and employers reopening is sort of part and parcel of that.
Thank you, Steve. I know it's 11:55 and I want to be mindful of our time. So I want to get to 1 or 2 more questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. And the next question is from Adrian, and it reads as follows. What is the role of our wealthy, mostly white communities in addressing these challenges and putting in place policies that create a more equitable distribution of opportunity? Ben, I know you and I were chatting about this, about whether there's an opportunity now in really getting white residents to support new affordable housing developments.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the most fundamental level, the question is getting communities to support housing development in general, right? We had a lot of difficulty passing housing legislation that would allow the majority of people in a community to say they want more housing
and zoning
projects go forward, right? So if we can't do housing choice, what kind of Commonwealth are we going to be in terms of equitable opportunity? I think we've got to figure out what the combination is of preserving the quality of life in our communities and getting the right kind of growth, but also making sure that we have inclusive and equitable Commonwealth. Part of that we can do with affordable housing and subsidies, but a lot of it has to be done through just allowing production of housing. I think everybody on this call will agree with that.
Yeah, addressing some of the zoning regulations that really prohibit new developments from happening. I agree with you. And for our final and last question, this comes from Stephanie. Were any other housing types presented as options in the community support question? For example, market rate, public housing, etc.?
All right, I'm on mute. The three that we presented in this specific survey were outlined on that slide. That certainly would be something potentially to explore in a future survey. The other thing that we are try to kind of balance in surveys like this is what kinds of things people will be able to immediately grasp, what terms they might understand. Of course, as many on this call know, even the terms that we use here perhaps are not fully understood by universally by the public, but it would be the kind of thing where if we were to survey on something like that, I think what we'd want to do would be take the time to describe what each one was so that people could kind of process what that kind of housing would potentially mean for their community. Whereas on this survey, we just had so many other things that we were doing that we couldn't obviously survey about everything that might have been pertinent to this topic. So not on this survey, but would love to look at something like that potentially on a future survey.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you everyone for joining us for your insightful questions. And thank you again to our presenters, Ben and Steve. As I mentioned at the start, this is an ongoing series, so please mark your calendars for our next event. How much learning has been lost? We will have data from a statewide survey of parents with school-aged children who have spent the last months remotely learning. This will be held June 24th at 11 a.m. Please do join us and keep an eye out for future discussions. Until then, be safe and well, and thank you.